Hello everyone, this is a revision or exam booster session for GCSE Economics under the AQA syllabus. We're looking at macroeconomics, which is paper 2, and we are looking at one of the 3 government policies. Today we're going to look at fiscal policy. So what do you need to know in preparation for your exam? You need to know how fiscal policy can affect levels of income and expenditure within an economy. Fiscal policy looks specifically at the flow of income coming into an economy and the decisions that government make on how that money is being spent. How fiscal policy can be used to achieve the 4 key macroeconomic objectives and the meaning of a balanced budget, and explain the consequences of operating either a budget surplus or a budget deficit. We will look at all these 3 key points within this revision session. So we start off simply by looking at what is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is one of 3 government policies. You've got fiscal policy, supply side policy, and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is used and implemented by the government. So fiscal policy involves the government changing the levels of taxation and government spending in order to influence either aggregate demand and the level of economic activity. Think about the 4 key objectives that governments have. If we look at economic growth, high levels of employment, stable inflation, and balance of payments. Fiscal policy, in effect, is a form of intervention from government to help them achieve either one of or all 4 objectives. Fiscal policy, in specifically, looks at how governments can change or manipulate the levels of taxation. Once you change those, that will have an effect then on tax revenue, the amount of money that governments get into an economy from collection of taxes. Once you get that money coming into an economy, the government then has the decision as to how do they spend that money. So the government collects revenue from taxation. Fiscal policy involves how they collect that tax and also where and how they will spend that money. All of it needs to be justified in terms of the achievement towards those key macroeconomic objectives. So fiscal policy is the use of government spending, taxation, and also government borrowing. Government borrowing and taxation are the main flows of income or revenue coming into an economy, and then governments must decide then how they spend that money to the benefit and service of the people within the economy. So fiscal policy is used by governments to help achieve the main macroeconomic objectives. And you'll remember these from your lessons. You would have looked at these each individually within lessons. Stable or low inflation, high levels of employment or low levels of unemployment, sustainable economic growth measured obviously through GDP, gross domestic product, and a stable balance of payments. So fiscal policy is a strategy or a form of intervention from government that allows them to work towards the achievement of all or 1 or 2 of these objectives. So fiscal policy involves the use of government spending, taxation, and borrowing to affect the level of growth of aggregate demand, output, and jobs in an economy. When we look at the idea of aggregate demand is the total demand for goods and services in an economy at a given period of time. So it's not, if you look at micro, you would look at the demand for one individual good within one individual market. In macroeconomics, when we look at aggregate demand, we look at the total demand for goods and services. And again, that also is linked with GDP as well. Aggregate demand, you're looking at the total demand for housing, the total demand for cars, the total demand for clothing of all brands and all makes within an economy. Add all of that together, the total demand for goods and services within an economy. It's also used to help impact the level of output, GDP. Governments can strategically implement fiscal policy to either encourage growth or indeed to scale back an economy, depending upon its stage in the economic cycle. So what strategies governments impose through fiscal policy will be very much so dependent on the state the economy is in when fiscal policy is implemented. It is also used to change the pattern of spending on goods and services, for example, healthcare and renewable energy. So governments will look at how much money they set aside every year for key elements of government spending. Some years, it may require more funding in certain areas than maybe in previous years. So if you think currently of the COVID-19 pandemic, governments have had to really look at how they use government spending in order to continue levels of economic growth in the middle of a global pandemic. So we have seen the NHS has received billions more in funding because we are in the middle of a global pandemic, which is affecting people's health. Okay, governments have spent increasingly more on education to help schools combat lost learning as a result of COVID-19. The furlough scheme, for example, governments paying benefits to individuals to stop them from becoming unemployed, again, to help keep those high levels of government objectives. Fiscal policy is also by which a distribution of income and wealth can be achieved. So when we look at a redistribution of income and wealth, we look at how in an economy, you will always have that gap between the rich and the poor. There will always be a group of individuals who are more wealthy than others, who have a greater income than others. You'll always have your high income earners and your low income earners. Fiscal policy, because it uses taxation and government spending, if we tax those on high incomes, we are taking a proportion of their income, and that is taken as a form of tax, income tax, a direct tax, a tax on income. We take a greater proportion of their income from taxation. We then use that tax revenue to then redistribute to maybe those on very low incomes through things like maybe paying benefits to those who cannot find a job. So for those who do have a job and those who do earn very high levels of income, we tax those individuals with that tax revenue that will go to fund somebody who maybe doesn't have a job. It keeps them in job seekers allowance up until the point in time where they are able to find a job. It keeps those on benefits to stop individuals who possibly through circumstances of birth have been unable to financially look after themselves. It can help to increase economic growth. And you'll remember that economic growth is one of the key government objectives and the productive capacity of the economy in the long run. So fiscal policy at its core looks at how governments can implement its spending in order to achieve economic growth. How can we get the economy onto the next stage as a result of a careful planning around government finances? How can we get that money coming in? And how can we use that effectively to get outcome from government spending? So for example, you're in school right now, engaging in full-time education. That's government spending. The government is spending for you to be educated. Only then for one day for you to go out, get a job, earn your own income, and then you pay taxes. When you pay taxes, that money will go back into the economy and keep that flow of education going year on year onto the next generation of young people. You help with the productive capacity of the economy. If you're engaged in full-time work, you are contributing towards production of goods and services within an economy. And that increase in production of goods and services will help to increase GDP, the gross domestic product, which measures economic growth. The role of fiscal policy and why it is important. So why is fiscal policy important? Why are you studying it? Why should anybody be interested in fiscal policy? Fiscal policy has a large impact on millions of consumers and businesses. It impacts both you and me. It impacts me because I'm a full-time employee. I'm engaged in full-time employment. It affects you because you benefit from fiscal policy. So even though you're a student and you're not engaged in full-time employment, fiscal policy in actual fact is allowing you to sit in classrooms. It's allowing you to benefit from face-to-face taught tuition every day. It allows you to go to school. It allows you to have access to public healthcare, which is free at point of access. It affects businesses because every business will pay tax and consumers will spend their disposable income being income after tax. Consumers will spend their income in these businesses. So if we cut the rate of tax, that will increase spending. So consumers will buy more, therefore businesses will supply more goods and services. When they supply more goods and services, the ultimate objective of every business is ultimately to make a profit. So fiscal policy affects businesses and their ability to make profits. It allows for financing government spending. Think of, and we will look at it in a few minutes now, where governments actually spend that money. Governments are responsible for keeping the public sector afloat. They're responsible for providing public services, services and goods and services which cannot or are not always feasible to provide if left to the operations of the free market, if left to the disciplines of the free market, if left to the private sector. There are some companies that wouldn't see a profit incentive from providing certain goods, and therefore it is the role of the government to provide those. Think of healthcare and education, for example. Not every household will be able to send their children to private schools. Not every household will be able to pay for private healthcare. Yet in this day and age, quite rightly, every individual through human rights has to be engaged in full-time education at a certain age, and everybody should have the right in this day and age to have access to proper quality healthcare. It looks at altering the redistribution of income and wealth. We look at implementing what we would like to believe is fair rates of tax to stop a situation where there is a huge gap in inequality. We do not want a situation in which you've got the super rich and those who simply have not got enough money to live on. You don't want a situation in an economy where you've got very, very wealthy individuals at the expense of a large group of individuals, or any group of individuals at that matter, or any size of group, where they do not have access to the basic goods and services to live a full and healthy life. Providing a welfare state safety net. There are some individuals who are unable to find work, and that is not always due to a fault of their own. It could be things like maybe they were born into poverty, and anyone that is born into poverty often struggles to get out of that poverty cycle. They find it more difficult to get jobs than others. Maybe their exposure to high levels of education wasn't as great as those in more wealthier areas. It allows people, for example, on disabilities to live off disability living allowance. Because of their health, because of their physical health, they're unable to engage in full-time practical work. And therefore, it calls upon the role of the government to look after these individuals. Managing the economic cycle. Governments will look at where they are at in the economic cycle. Are they in a period of decline, for example? Do we need to spend more money to kickstart the economy? Do we need to try and influence people's ability to spend more, or indeed maybe to spend less? Are we on the road to rising levels of inflation? If we see inflation rising, what can we do to maybe try and cap the levels of consumer spending? Because too much spending by consumers can be quite harmful for the economy, and we'll look at the consequences of that later. We also want to look at improving competitiveness within a country. How can we remain competitive with other countries? What can we do as a country that makes ourselves ahead of the game in industry, in infrastructure, in education, in productivity of workers, in standards of living, for example? And also to tackle market failures. Think of those indirect taxes, taxes on cigarettes, taxes on alcohol, taxes on pollution, for example. Those are all market failures. You look at alcohol, cigarettes, as a result of overconsumption of those goods, governments can implement tax to reduce the number of people, or to try and reduce the number of people who do smoke and who do drink alcohol, because large amounts of that is having a significant financial strain on the NHS being funded and provided by the state. So governments need revenue in order to spend. You cannot spend money if you haven't got it. So revenue is income. It's money coming into the economy. Okay, the main source of income is taxation, and there are two types of taxation. The first one is direct taxation. So this is a tax levied. Levied means placed on. So it's a tax that's levied on income, wealth, and profits. Three things. So if I look at myself as an individual, as a teacher, when I get my paycheck every month, the government will take a proportion of that in income tax. It's a tax on my earnings as a school teacher. A tax on wealth, inheritance tax, for example, and a tax on profits. Businesses would have to pay tax on their profits. That's called corporation tax. So if a business makes profit, the government will tax a percentage of that profit in the form of corporation tax. Direct taxes include income tax, inheritance tax, national insurance contributions, capital gains tax, and corporation tax. The other form of taxation then is indirect taxation. These are taxes on spending, a tax on goods and services. So it's a tax on consumption. If you purchase a good or service, it could be, for example, VAT, value added tax. So examples of indirect taxes include excise duties on fuel, cigarettes and alcohol, and value added tax, VAT, on many different goods and services. You can have a unit tax or a value added tax. A unit tax is a set amount of tax on a good, regardless of its price. So for example, you could have a unit tax on bottles of wine. So you could put, for example, a £2 unit tax on a bottle of wine that costs £10. If that bottle of wine costs £50, the unit tax is still the same. It's £2. It's £2 for every bottle of wine, regardless of the price of it. If you were to put VAT on a bottle of wine, VAT would be a set percentage of the value of that bottle of wine. Producers may be able to pass on a greater burden of tax depending on the PED of the good. Standard rule of thumb would be that if the good is more inelastic, the firm is able to pass on a greater burden of the tax onto the consumer. That basically means that the consumer pays the heavier price of the tax. So that's the main sources of income from government, from taxation, both direct and indirect taxation. So when they get it, they have to think very carefully then about what they're going to do with it, how they're going to spend that money. So they look at the money coming in and they think then very carefully about where in the economy should we spend this in order to help achieve our 4 key macroeconomic objectives. So government spending is spending by the public sector on goods and services such as education, healthcare, and defense. So it's payment on the public sector. We all rely on the public sector. Now, government spending is split into 3 different sections. The first one is, and this is in no particular order, but the first one is transfer payments. Now, transfer payments is payments to things like welfare spending. It could be, for example, payments to somebody who is on job seekers allowance. Now, normally we would say with transfer payments, we get nothing back in return, or the government gets nothing back in return. It is money that is spent, but individuals don't get that money, or the government doesn't see that money coming back into the economy again. Recurring spending is often called current spending, which is on public services. So if you think very carefully, maybe, for example, paying the wages of teachers, paying the wages of police officers, for example, it could be paying for your books in school. It could be keeping utility bills paid for in schools, hospitals, paying for medication if you were to go and see the GP, for example. So it keeps the public sector services afloat every day. Investment projects or capital spending, as it's sometimes referred to as. So this is spending by the government on long-term capital projects. And this could be things like new airports. It could be new roads, new motorways. Think of Crossrail, for example. It could be the physical building of a new school, the physical building of a new hospital in an area where there's growing levels or rising levels of the population. For example, building more schools to cope with the rising levels of population, developing current roads, making motorways safer, including more motorways to allow that free movement of trade and that more efficient movement of trade around the country. Also used as well to improve the mobility of labour, getting people to and from work. Other examples of government spending, you've got social order. So again, policing, law and order, paying for public courts. So for example, if you were to go to a law case or a court of law, that would be funded by the state to ensure law, order and justice. The emergency services, if you were to call for a paramedic, for example, to ring for an ambulance, that all of that is funded by the state through the NHS. Healthcare, education, defence, foreign aid. Sometimes governments will set aside money to help out other countries who are in desperate need of financial assistance because of whatever circumstances they find themselves in. The environment, what we're seeing recently because of the rising impact and people becoming more knowledgeable about their impact as global citizens, the impact on our environment. Governments will spend more, for example, on developing wind energy, more renewable sources of energy, spending to try and cut down on the amount of carbon emissions We are taking the environment much more seriously to try and protect that for future generations. Agriculture is very heavily subsidized by the government. Remember, things like changes to the weather can affect agricultural crops. Governments may need to step in to support that crucial industry, because remember, the agriculture industry is important for providing us with food. Industry and commerce, we've seen huge spending by governments to try and keep businesses operating and still afloat during the global pandemic of COVID-19. The furlough scheme, for example, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, governments paying for people to go out and have dinner in a restaurant simply to try and put money back into the economy again, to get people out, to get them spending on the high street. For example, governments can subsidize businesses. Maybe they want to encourage businesses to increase their production of certain goods and services to help achieve government objectives. Transport, public transport. Think of when you get the buses at the end of the school day, TfL, all of that is funded by the state. Regions, sometimes governments can spend more money in certain regions to help that type of, to regenerate those areas. So maybe you might have areas where there's low levels of unemployment, there's high levels of crime, there's just low levels of economic activity. Governments might try and maybe subsidize firms or provide financial incentives for firms to want to set up in those areas. Maybe we improve the roads in those areas, build better housing. That might improve the quality of those areas. And that brings with it greater levels of jobs, etc. Culture, media, and the sport. Those, the attraction to tourism, for example. Governments they realize that this industry is very profitable. It's a very lucrative style of industry, certainly in the UK, and governments have a duty of care to try and spend money in those industries to get people involved in culture, media, and sport. If we look at the economic, the importance of government spending, first and foremost, any type of government spending, if governments are sitting down thinking, how are we going to spend this money, they have to look at, if we do spend that money, what is the outcome going to be on economic growth? Are we going to achieve rising levels of GDP as a result of economic government spending? What about regional economic impact? Are we going to face situations where you've still got the north-south divide, for example, where the south is seen to be more productive and more economically advanced than that of the north? Governments may want to invest more in certain regions to try and make sure that there's greater levels of equality across the UK, and that we don't have situations which are populated by the super rich and other areas that are populated by those living in poverty, for example. The provision of public and merit goods, so keeping our schools afloat while still providing an outstanding quality of education, keeping our hospitals afloat, keeping people safe, keeping people healthy, keeping street lights going, keeping policing going so that people can feel safe in their areas and their homes. Achieving greater levels of equity in society, and equity means fairness. So if we look at it, some people would argue it's fair, and I would agree that we don't have these rising levels of inequality in society. It shouldn't be the case where you've got people who have got excessive amounts of income and those who have so little that they simply cannot live off it, and it's not fit for human survival. We cannot have that in society, and governments must look carefully at how they're spending to reduce inequalities and to prevent any potential of further inequalities in the future. So governments will look at, why is it important? It's ultimately important because government spending brings about economic growth, the ultimate achievement of that first main objective. So let's have a look at a worked example. What I'm going to do here is going to talk you through almost like a logical chain of reasoning, a chain of analysis. So if we look at spending on education and training, so governments, they've brought in their tax revenue and they're going to spend money on education and training. What impact is that going to have? So if we spend more money on education and training, what's that going to happen? It will increase the skills and productivity of the workers. People are much more educated, they're much more skilled, and as a result, they're able to put that newfound knowledge into the workplace. They come up with new ideas, they're more productive. The more educated worker is the worker that's going to bring more ideas to the table. They're going to be more productive, they've got better qualifications, they're more attractive to employers. The more educated employee is likely to be more attractive to a future employer. Improvements in human capital may lower structural unemployment or reduce unemployment. So it will help that idea of lowering levels of unemployment. Just notice a mistake there. Greater employment, so you've got greater income flows, greater spending in the economy. So you've got a situation in which, as a result, that workers are now much more skilled. We have a situation in which there are now higher levels of employment because they're more attractive to employers. Because they've now got a job and because their skill set is very high, often you will find that the higher the level of your skill set, the higher the level of the wage that you will attract. That's greater income flows, which will lead then to greater spending in the economy. That greater spending then has a multiplier effect. It has a ripple effect on society. Individuals then spend that money in businesses. Businesses then will then look for greater levels of investment, for example. Higher incomes, higher flow of income tax. So if more people are working, we've got more income tax that we can take from these people. If they're in higher paid jobs, in some cases, we can take a higher proportion of their income in income tax. And this will lead to greater investment by firms. There's great confidence that with this rise in spending will bring with it an increase in sales for firms, and they may seek to maybe increase the size of their productive capacity. They might increase the size of their factories and plants, for example. It will lead to greater investment by businesses, and that's a constant cycle over time. However, evaluation. One of the main issues with spending money on education, one, it is that it is very, very expensive. There is a time lag with spending money on education. If you look at, if you were to go from primary school into secondary school and even up to A levels, if you include reception, that's 7 years in primary school and then 7 years then in secondary school. That's 14 years of spending to get you to the end of A levels. So the government is spending money on you for 14 years, and then you might choose to go off to university for 3 or 4 years before you actually take your first full-time job. So that could be up to, in some cases, 11, 12 years before the government can actually get any type of income tax or return from you. That money might be better spent targeting certain groups or ages. So there's always the argument with, well, if we increase spending in education, that prevents money from being spent elsewhere. So there is an opportunity cost with all forms of government spending. If I choose to spend it in this area, I forgo my ability to spend it in another area. Let's have a look at another example. What about spending money on healthcare and keeping the NHS afloat? So if we spend money on healthcare, its improved health outcomes will boost active labour supply. It means that people are physically fit to supply their labour. May also increase labour productivity. They take less days off work because they're not sick. They're more healthier. Okay. As a result, they're spending more hours and days in work, contributing towards the production of goods and services. Greater employment. More people are now physically fit, more people are now physically healthy. As a result of being physically fit and physically healthy, they therefore are able to take jobs. And that will help increase levels of employment, helping the government achieve its macroeconomic objectives. It will then lead to greater income flows, which will therefore lead to greater spending, which is economic growth. So it's again that multiplier effect of money coming into the economy. You're getting that money back. You're spending money in healthcare, and you're profiting or seeing the outcome through things like higher levels of employment and those greater income flows. More people on jobs, reduce risk of poverty. If people are getting jobs because they're physically fit to get them and they're educated, it means that there's no risk that employers will not take them on. As a result, they get high levels of income that is higher than what they would get if they were on benefits, and therefore it prevents the risk of poverty. However, again, evaluation, better health results can be achieved without increase in health funding. Sometimes, for example, people think that we should look at the behavior of individuals. So, for example, if individuals had a more healthier diet, then they would be healthy. So people would argue spend less on the NHS, but spend more on making sure that children eat healthy food whenever they're in school, for example. Spend more to reduce the price of healthier food. Maybe subsidize going to the gym. Maybe open up new sports centres in certain regions, certainly in areas where they've been closed down, to try and encourage it to be a social norm to be fit and healthy. It will lower income families, get improved access. So in some cases, there is a very, currently now, the NHS provides a very good quality service. However, some individuals cannot always have access to that service. What about the elderly who are unable to go into hospitals for regular checkups and appointments? Are they not benefiting from those regular checkups and appointments because they are unable to leave their homes, for example? Maybe there isn't a service that helps those individuals to get to hospital whenever they need to. So if we look at some of the possible impacts of deep cuts in state spending, now, certainly over the past couple of years, we have seen significant amounts of fiscal austerity, where the governments seem to be raising taxes and lowering the degree of spending. Let's have a look at 3 different types of impacts that could have. The first one, impact 1, what happens on jobs? If the government cut public spending, it could lead to higher levels of unemployment. And again, that goes against the government's objective to try and increase levels of employment. It could mean that many public sector areas, for example, the armed forces, local authorities, have seen many redundancies. We have seen a large number of redundancies in the public sector. There is still a public sector operating, still providing a service, but we've seen reduced services in some cases. Public libraries, for example, we've seen large numbers of redundancies in areas like that. So governments might look at, can we really afford this? And can we afford maybe to pull that form of government spending? Impact 2, what happens on those essential public services? Some of those public services will be more essential to others than what they would be to some. So if we reduced spending, could it possibly lead to lower standard and quality of public and merit goods, such as education and local authority services? So for example, when governments, they recently, a few years ago, reduced the amount of spending that schools get in real terms, it led to having to cut curriculums, having to lower the number of subjects that were made available to students because schools could not finance them. It meant reducing and making redundancies, larger class sizes. For example, some schools were desperate to try and manage their funding, that they had to reduce the hours of the school day because they simply could not keep the school financially afloat. We've seen huge cuts to healthcare in previous years. And of course, in the middle of a global pandemic, we are paying the true price of it now. You see articles frequently in the newspapers about cuts to healthcare, which means that some individuals wait for almost up to 10 hours for an ambulance. If you're calling for an ambulance, you're in a state of emergency. But if you have to wait up to 8 to 10 hours for an ambulance, that is no good. That's the public sector is failing in its duty to protect society. Impact 3, economic growth. What would happen to economic growth if we reduced public spending? Economic growth could lead to negative multiplier effects. Many private sector jobs depend on public sector demand. So if you take, for example, your textbooks, your exercise books, we buy those in from private companies. If you look at the building of new roads, for example, governments could contract in individuals from the private sector. They could buy tar from private sector companies to build those roads. They could buy bricks and blocks and cement from private companies in order to increase infrastructure in the UK. If we reduced government spending and we're spending less on infrastructure, that could have negative multiplier effects, ripple effects on the private sector and individual households. So, fiscal policy and the budget. We've established that fiscal policy is that flow of money coming into the economy and money going out of the economy through public spending. So revenue from taxation to influence in government spending. Now you'll see here, I've included a picture of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, our current Chancellor of the Exchequer in January 2022, Rishi Sunak. Now, the role of the Chancellor of the Exchequer is to prepare the budget. So fiscal policy is set out in the government budget. And when he holds up that red briefcase, which you might see on television, that briefcase contains the paperwork for the intricate details of the budget, where he outlines where that money is going to come in from taxation and where that money is going to go out in the form of public spending. The budget gives a forecast of government spending and taxation for the coming financial year, outlining spending totals and tax rates, as well as reviewing outcomes for the tax year about to end. So governments, whenever they're preparing their new budget, they will reflect on their success of the previous budget. We said that we would collect money in from here to spend money on this area. How effective was that spending? What return do we see on that spending? Was it worthwhile? Did we get the value from money that we would expect? So 3 key things I want you to think about, and you need to know, you might want to jot these down when it comes to the budget. The first is you can operate, or the government can deliberately choose to operate at a budget deficit. Now, sometimes it can be planned. In some cases, the governments work to try and get out of a budget deficit. But a budget deficit means that planned spending is greater than government revenue, mainly from taxation. So a deficit exists when the government is spending more than what they're getting in from government revenue. Now, a budget deficit is not always a good thing, certainly in the long run. What governments can do is they can, in the short term, and think about your evaluation, think about your discount with the budget deficit. It's okay to operate a budget deficit in the short run. Maybe, for example, you're trying to come out of a recession, and naturally you want to try and kickstart spending in the economy, and governments might need to spend more on the economy to try and encourage those more positive multiplier effects, to then one day hopefully operate on a budget surplus, which we'll look at now in a second. You may also, what you don't want to do is continually operate on a budget deficit, because that's just basically poor financial planning. You're simply spending too much and you're not getting enough in. You're spending more than what you're getting in. A budget surplus means that planned spending is less than government revenue. So in actual fact, the government is bringing in more revenue than what they're spending. So they've got less, they're spending less, but more money is coming in. Again, think about when they would use, or when they would want to operate a budget surplus. Maybe the economy in the past was spending too much. Maybe we need to cap spending and look at building up a budget surplus in the event to invest in larger projects later on. A balanced budget then is when government receipts or revenue equal government spending in a financial year. So the government basically, when they operate a balanced budget, the exact figure of money coming into an economy exactly equals the exact figure of money going out of the economy through government spending. So some key points then about the budget. What happens if there's a budget surplus? A surplus can be used to pay previous borrowing, i.e. to repay national debt, to the public sector debt repay. So let's say, for example, in 1 year, the government operates a 100 million budget surplus. Maybe in the previous financial year, they were operating on a deficit. So the surplus they make on this year can be used to pay back on maybe a previous year's borrowing. We have a golden rule, or the government would have a golden rule, that the government target to have a surplus or balanced budget over the economic cycle, keeping government revenue in line with government spending. So ideally, what is the situation you want? You don't want a continuous budget deficit. You want to try and maintain a budget, a balanced budget across a financial year. It's often very difficult to strike a balanced budget, but you want to try and get as close to it as you can. What happens if the budget deficit is persistent? What happens if we keep operating on a budget deficit year after year after year going into the long term? Governments must borrow money from the public sector net cash requirement. Now, we don't like borrowing money, and governments will have to borrow money simply to fulfill their duty of providing the public sector for the state. How do you then get rid of a budget deficit? So if we don't like, or the government doesn't like operating a budget deficit, what can be done to try and get rid of it? We could try and decrease public spending. So the consequence of a budget deficit is that it could lead to the government's taking on the decision of decreasing public spending. We might have to spend less on schools, on defense, on healthcare, on industry, for example, to try and build up greater revenues and spend less. We might have to look at increasing taxation, increasing income tax. And again, think of the wider consequences of that. It could potentially lead to situations where individuals will have less disposable income and they'll be spending less in the economy. More of their income is being spent or going to the government in the form of tax, and they've got less to spend on what they freely want on goods and services. So they may have to rein in their spending and spend less. Demand side fiscal policy. I'm going to introduce you to two concepts: contractionary fiscal policy and expansionary fiscal policy. First of all, though, discretionary fiscal policy involves deliberate changes in tax and indirect taxation and government spending. For example, increased capital spending on roads and infrastructure. So discretionary fiscal policy is when the government deliberately changes their tax rates or deliberately changes how they offer tax or how they implement tax in order to influence government spending. So they may sit down and think, we need to spend more money on schools and healthcare and infrastructure. Let us therefore increase the rate of income tax. Let us increase national insurance contributions. Let us increase VAT on certain goods, because by doing that, we will then increase revenues to therefore be able to fund this increased spending. Expansionary fiscal policy is defined as an increase in government expenditures and or a decrease in taxes that causes the government's budget deficit to increase or its budget surplus to decrease. So expansionary fiscal policy is creative management of the finances to increase government spending. Now, governments are spending more, and they do this by decreasing taxes. So by decreasing taxes, it could lead to, for example, increasing levels of consumption. And that has positive multiplier effects on the economy. We decrease consumption, therefore consumers buy more goods and services. Businesses see an increase in business activity. They may employ more workers to produce these goods and services to cope with the increase in the demand for these goods and services. And therefore that has a constant ripple effect. Higher incomes, greater levels of tax revenue from income tax, for example. Contractionary fiscal policy is defined as a decrease in government expenditure and an increase in taxes that causes the government's budget deficit to decrease or its budget surplus to increase. So if we were currently in a budget deficit, what could the government do? If the government were in a budget deficit, they may look to maybe implement contractionary fiscal policy to try and reduce the amount of deficit they have, to encourage individuals to spend more in the economy. So fiscal policy is said to be expansionary if the government is trying to positively stimulate economic activity. So when we look at expansionary fiscal policy, the clue is in the name. We want to grow the economy. We want things, we want rising levels of economic growth. We want greater levels of activity in the economy. What methods then could they use? So if the government wanted to implement expansionary fiscal policy to stimulate economic activity, they could look at cutting taxes. A cut in income tax may give consumers more disposable income, thus raising the levels of consumption. So if we cut income tax, individuals will have more money to spend. They'll have more disposable income. They may choose to spend those goods, spend that money on goods and services. Evaluation would be the risk that they could start saving more rather than spending. Because when you spend, that money flows back into the economy again. For businesses, they could look at a cut in corporation tax. It may increase available profits for firms, which subsequently may stimulate investment. So it incentivizes firms to want to maybe purchase new, bigger, better capital machinery because they have to spend less of their profits on taxation. Okay, governments are taking less from businesses. We could also look at raising levels or rising the levels of government spending. The government may increase its spending on core infrastructure projects or increase the pay of public sector workers. So governments could build new schools, new hospitals, they could build new roads, new airports, for example, to improve that flow and that mobility of labour across the UK. They could look at increasing the pay of public sector workers, pay teachers, doctors, nurses, for example. Let's pay them civil servants, let's pay them more money. And if we pay them more money, that means that they'll have more money to spend in the economy. They'll go out, they'll buy more goods and services that will increase the demand for goods and services. Therefore, it will influence firms to produce goods and services to keep up with that rising levels of demand, therefore having the positive multiplier effects of that rising levels of economic growth. We could look at increasing the budget deficit. So another way of increasing spending, if the government do not wish to raise taxation, is to increase borrowing. So if we want the economy, if we want to try and kickstart the economy, certainly after a global pandemic, if we're after a recession, what could we do? We could look at increasing levels of borrowing. Let's borrow money now to put into the economy with the hope that things will grow and get better later on. This can be spent on a variety of projects nationally. So look at that borrowing and try and invest it into projects which will reap further financial returns in the long run. However, this adds to the national debt and must be repaid with interest. So borrowing for the government is just like borrowing for you and I from a bank. We would still have to pay interest on that. How could tax cuts stimulate economic recovery? Consumer spending, cuts in VAT or income tax to boost demand for goods and services. What about then the low confidence? Tax cuts likely to be saved rather than spent. We're looking at evaluation here. It's all well and good cutting the rate of tax, but how are consumers going to react to that? How will households react? Ideally, the government would make the decision to cut taxes with the intention that it would boost the demand for goods and services. It would encourage consumers to spend more. However, there is a risk that some consumers and households may choose to save that money. And that might be partly due to low levels of confidence. Maybe they're worried that this is only a short-lived tax cut and better to save because the government might increase taxes in the long run again. Business investment. If we cut tax to stimulate business investment, lower corporation tax to increase investment and tax incentives for research and development. Businesses might then, the evaluation of that is businesses might choose to invest overseas instead. So governments might try and encourage firms in the UK to increase their business investment. However, there's a risk that firms may choose to operate overseas. And once they do, then the government loses out on their productivity and service and levels of employment within the UK. If we cut income tax, we say that that acts as an incentive for individuals to take up jobs. So it could lead to lower employment taxes, reduced national insurance so that business creates more jobs. The difficulty of that then, or the evaluative issue, is that if we lower employment taxes, the government subsequently receives less in government revenue from taxation. Skills shortages might limit new job creation. So is it a case that people will take up jobs in industries where the government currently see skills shortages? Lower fuel or carbon taxes. So lower costs for businesses, less inflation and higher profits. When a business lowers its costs, they may be able to pass on those costs to consumers in the form of lower prices. The consequence of that, the evaluation of that, is that that's all well and good. However, if we lower fuel and carbon taxes, it almost acts as a way that firms can argue that they can create higher levels of pollution. Okay, and that has a conflict with environmental policies. Governments have a duty of care to look after the economy. Fiscal policy is said to be contractionary. If the government is trying to constrain aggregate demand, reduce debt, and control inflation. So you would implement contractionary fiscal policy if there was rising levels of debt and if there was very high levels of inflation and growth in effect was too big, growth was too much for the economy to cope with. Methods include then the opposite effect. What about increasing taxes? If income tax is raised, this may discourage spending and reduce consumption. Consumers will spend less because they've got less disposable income because their income tax has risen. This will reduce aggregate demand and may help to bring inflation under control. So if you see a fall in aggregate demand, that's a shift to the left of the AD curve, that will bring down the levels of inflation and will help bring inflation under control. Inflation being the rising levels of goods, prices of goods and services in an economy over a period of time. Also, with contractionary fiscal policy, governments may look at cutting government spending. So they may look at a situation in which they have to spend less on public sector services. The government may decide to reduce expenditure on public projects or cut key government budgets if it considers excessive government spending to be unaffordable or perhaps inflationary. So the governments will look at this and simply say, whilst it is good, we simply cannot afford it, and we have to reduce the spending in that area. They could use contractionary fiscal policy if they're currently operating a budget deficit. The UK budget deficit is large and thus must be repaid with interest. So governments, when they're preparing the budget, will always have to factor in that they will have to meet repayments to any type of previous borrowing. And those repayments must be catered for first before you can start distributing those government spending out across other key areas. Cutting the government's long-term borrowing commitments may help to stabilize economic growth, as reduced debt repayments in future can be reinvested back into the economy. There will come a time when the government does pay off its deficit, and when it does, that means they no longer have to set aside money every year to pay back previous debt, but that money then becomes freely available for them to increase funding across all other areas of the economy. A danger here is that we often have a conflict of objectives. So if I look at one suggested policy, if I look at fiscal austerity, I'm looking at increasing income tax and maybe reducing government spending. If I implement fiscal austerity, I increase income tax, it will reduce consumer spending to put a downward pressure on prices. So if consumer spending decreases, that means that demand for goods and services have fallen because consumers have less disposable income. And if you think about your demand curve, that inward shift in the demand, it will decrease demand, therefore bringing a reduction in the price of the equilibrium price of a good. Where we see a fall in prices, we could subsequently see, or we see a fall in consumer demand for goods and services. That could lead to a reduction in the supply of goods and services, and therefore a loss of real GDP from contracting demand. So if consumers are demanding less, firms will supply less, therefore GDP will decrease. And remember, if GDP is decreasing, the economy is not growing. And therefore, we're not achieving that objective of economic growth. Let's look at another policy suggestion. What happens if we lower the rate of tax? So this is the opposite effect. So if we lower the rate of tax or freeze the level of duties on fuel, alcohol, tobacco, what happens if we were to cut pollution taxes? Well, that could lead to, in effect, first of all, if you look at spending, if you were to reduce taxation, it increases disposable income. And one of the dangers of that is it's the opposite effect of the first policy. It could lead to rising levels of inflation. And again, that contradicts government policies. You're trying to say, I want high levels of economic growth, I want high levels of employment, but that is going to come at the expense of high levels of inflation. What about if we were to cut pollution taxes? That's all well and good. However, that will contradict government objectives over their commitment to protecting the environment. If I look at policy suggestion 3, I'm going to use fiscal policy and I'm going to increase spending in infrastructure to boost the nation's productive capacity and productivity. I want better roads. I want better mobility for people to do free movement of trade, to get to and from work, for example. What's the dangers of that? Well, the dangers of that is it could lead to long time lags and that to take full effect. So if you look at, for example, if you were to build a new school, if you were to build a new motorway, for example, they are not built overnight. They take time to be built. And it takes time, certainly with infrastructure. Think about the length of time it takes to build motorways, for example. It's very much so a long-term strategy, a long-term means of funding. So I've given you a very detailed overview of what is meant by fiscal policy, how it could be used, an overview on the budget, the difference between a budget surplus and a budget deficit and how to manage those. We've looked at expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy. For your 9-mark questions and your 15-mark questions on fiscal policy, you will need to evaluate the use of the policy. And it is always best to evaluate against the effectiveness of fiscal policy towards achieving the macroeconomic objective. So let's have a look at this. Let's look at evaluating the effectiveness of fiscal policy in achieving economic growth, the first main objective. Expansionary policy alone won't increase the long-run growth rate, but will act as a short-run stimulus to economic growth. So we need to look at, with the budget, how much of that spending and how much of that tax is short-run, how much of it is long-run. Do we invest too much into long-run spending and therefore we don't reap the benefits straight away and we don't grow the economy as quickly as what we should or what we ought to? However, fiscal stimulus through tax cuts and increasing government spending may be employed to lift a country out of a recession, therefore smoothing out fluctuations in the economic cycle. So when you get to that stage of discom, it depends on, you could argue it depends upon the state of the economy. Expansionary fiscal policy may be good if the economy is trying to get itself out of a recession. So think about, maybe we should increase government spending to try and kickstart the economy again. Let us reduce income tax to give people the confidence to go out there and spend, to put money back into the high street so that we can kickstart growth and GDP in the economy. Some economists favor this approach and might consider increasing the government's budget deficit in the short run, a necessary requirement to put an economy back on target in terms of its economic growth. So we have situations in which a budget deficit or increase in the budget deficit, it can be justified. And that could be maybe one of your recommendations. You recommend the government should invest into expansionary fiscal policy. They should increase the budget deficit to try and increase that level of spending in the economy again. Unemployment and high levels of employment. Higher government spending could lead to higher levels of employment if there are good policies to support training programs and back to work schemes. So you could argue that fiscal policy will influence the level and degree and quality of education. Therefore, if governments spend more on education and training, that could lead to rising numbers of people who are able to take jobs in industry. And if they're able to take a job, they won't have to rely on the state to provide benefits. Once they do get a job, they'll be able then to pay income tax. The use of fiscal policy to improve employment statistics is a vital part of economic policy. The furlough scheme, for example, was crucial in the UK maintaining its high level of employment. Tax credit and welfare changes are ongoing. Keep up to date with these. Always have one or two of them up your sleeve. Know about what the current levels or current situation is around employment in the UK. What about inflation? Fiscal policy is a fairly blunt instrument with which to seek to control the price level. So fiscal policy can be used to try and control pricing levels around levels of inflation. So for example, if inflation is rising, you might want to implement contractionary policy. Let's pull back government spending. Let's increase taxes to pull back on consumer spending. In theory, expansionary policy will boost AD and create inflationary pressure, whilst contractionary policy may do the opposite. So in your evaluations, if you're suggesting expansionary fiscal policy has many benefits. However, it depends upon the level of inflation which could be brought about as a result of this expansion. In reality, it is very difficult to fine-tune the economy towards a 2% inflation target using broad instruments such as taxation and government spending. Basically, what we're saying here is that a fiscal policy can be used to control inflation, but it is not the sole policy that can be used to control inflation. Really, fiscal needs to work alongside monetary and supply side policies. In any case, the causes of inflation are varied and come from many sources, which fiscal policy cannot control. For example, increasing raw material costs from abroad. So the inflation may not be brought about by actions of the UK, but instead it may actually be brought about as a result of rising prices in a foreign country in which the UK is importing those goods from. And lastly, then, we look at the balance of payments on the current account. The UK has a high propensity to import, so expansionary policy tends to limit our ability to achieve this target. However, the government could employ expenditure switching policies, for example, taxing foreign imports to make domestic goods more attractive. So we need to look at, we do tend to rely very much so on importing. And we could use fiscal policy to try and bring the current account more to balance. We could say, well, if we realize we're importing more, let's look at the resources available to us in the UK. Let us try and encourage more domestic goods that are produced within the domestic country. In order to do that, let's tax on imports to act as a disincentive to import and to create an incentive to produce more goods within the domestic country. That is the end of this presentation. I hope that you found this useful in giving you an overview of fiscal policy. This is designed to help you with analysis, application, and evaluation, but please use this revision video alongside the notes that you have been given in lesson. I hope that you find that useful.